And welcome back to the showrunner. So happy to have you here with us this week. I am your host, Jared Morris, the host of the Assembly Call and Podcast on the Brink and Site Success, and of course, the showrunner. And I am joined, as I always am, by my co-host, Johnny Naster, the host of Hack the Entrepreneur. Johnny, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Doing very well. Again, feels good to be back.
It does.
Feels almost like we're getting into a groove.
It does. Every week we get further removed from the hiatus. It becomes just part of the weekly workflow, and I like it.
Yeah,
I like it, man.
I'm just sorry. Anybody out there listening right now, greatly appreciate you sticking through this with us as we figure it out. But we're back fully for you now.
We are, and I am so energized. I don't know if you got the Slack message that I sent you last night, but I went to the Podcast Dallas meetup, and I hadn't been to one in a while, and it was so much fun. Like there wasn't an actual speaker planned. It was kind of a free-for-all where people could come and just ask questions about their shows. And it was so cool to be around people that were in the initial stages of getting their show ready. They've got that enthusiasm. They've got all the ideas and the excitement and the energy. You know, they just need to maybe be pointed in a specific direction or, you know, figure this one little thing out to get moving. And it was so much fun being able to just take, you know, the stuff that we've just learned by experience that we sometimes take for granted, you know, that, you know, we just know this just because we've done a lot of shows, and be able to, you know, kind of find that one little piece of advice that helped it click for people. And it was one of those moments that reminded me all over again why I love doing this show. You know, just that moment where you reconnect with the audience and you feel that connection, and it was so much fun. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. I'm so glad that we're back doing this. And I just and look, this is kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about today, but I just get so excited when we get to serve this particular audience that we are fortunate enough to have here with the showrunner.
So one of my favorite parts of doing the show, for anybody out there listening, is being in bed in the morning and opening up my phone, the thing you're not supposed to do, but I like to slowly get up and just read some stuff and see 15 Slack messages and open it up. And it's this long, and you can sense Jared's excitement through it. And then the fact that he writes it in all caps lock to you.
Was it in all caps?
No. Oh. It seemed like it should have been. It was so excited. It was like sentence. It was like, today's gonna be a good day. I can tell.
So, I had a lot of ideas last night. A lot of ideas. This is why we need you here, so that you can keep my eye on the ball.
We've done shows on this before, and
yes,
that's just your place now to put ideas, which is cool. Everybody needs places to put these ideas, because when you're inspired by them, that's the time to jot them down, because then you have them that time you don't have inspiration and you want to move forward on something. So by all means, I love it.
So this week we're starting a series, and it's a series on reassessment. And so today we're going to talk about why it's important to reassess, why you even want to run a show in the first place. And we have 3 questions that we will suggest as questions that you should ask yourself about why you want to run a show at all. So we'll get to that here in just a minute, but I want to preview the 3 upcoming episodes that we have. Next week, we're going to talk about why it's time to reassess how you are positioning your podcast. We're going to talk the week after that about reassessing the experience that you are delivering to your audience. And then after that, we're probably going to have Toby on from 24 Sound and talk about reassessing your audio production process. So, you know, these episodes will work and be relevant for you if you're new and if you're just getting started, because these are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about as you get your show off the ground and get ready to roll. But they will definitely be relevant if you've been doing this for a little while, because these are some things, you know, some decisions that you might have made in the beginning and that you haven't thought about again. And maybe you're 25 episodes in or 50 episodes in or 400 episodes in, but it's always good to kind of take a step back and regularly review these things, because there may be things that have changed. There may be, new processes or new tools that you can use, or just ways that you can improve upon these. And so that's why we want to kind of take this step to the side here with these episodes and do some reassessment. And we're going to kind of walk you through how we've done some of this reassessment with our own shows, and then encourage you to do it with your show as well. Johnny, before we begin, just any general thoughts on the importance of regularly doing some reassessment with your show, no matter how far along in the game you are?
Absolutely. I think so. I got to go out for dinner with some people. I knew one of them last night, but some other people I didn't know. And we're just talking about podcasts, about business, about all kinds of things. And it's this idea of sometimes I think getting so into the thick of creating and putting out and just doing the work that needs to be done to do what it is you're doing. So as a showrunner, just the act of having to create, publish, write, all those things, promote your show, it takes like a laser like focus where you're just doing that and you're doing that sort of at the best level you can do it. And sometimes I think if you don't have somebody, hopefully we can be that person for you, but to come and just tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, you gotta step back for a bit. Like, it's awesome what you're doing, but every once in a while you do have to sort of come up for air, get that sort of big picture view of what you're doing. And I mean, I'm blessed and I take it for granted, I think sometimes, that I do have those people to sort of knock me off it and be like, hey, just make sure what you're doing is sort of, because you're putting in the work, make sure that all that work is going sort of to the right place in the right direction. So I also really like the way you've set this up, Jared, is because sometimes that's really hard to do for ourselves, but because you've sort of phrased it as three questions you can ask yourself, you can jot these questions down and have them there, and you'll see them once in a while, and maybe you'll just actually look at the question and try to answer it. And that's, to me, that's enough sometimes to really just to make sure you are, when you're giving it 100%, that you are giving it sort of in the right direction.
Yeah. And here's the great thing about this is the worst thing that can happen when you go through and ask yourself the questions that we're going to suggest today or in any of these upcoming episodes. When you do this reassessment on any area of your show, the worst thing that can happen is that you reaffirm what you've already been doing. And that's fine. Like, if reassessing doesn't necessarily mean you have to make a change. You may reaffirm and be like, hey, you know what I'm doing, the reason why I'm doing this, whatever it is, I'm right on track, and this is awesome. And you can move forward in that direction. It's almost like you can double down and you can accelerate a little bit because, man, you know that you're really doing this right and you've reaffirmed it and you are ready to go. The further that you get from the last time that you've reassessed these things, things, as I mentioned, things can change. And so it really can give you some extra confidence. And if the worst thing that happens is you reaffirm what you're doing, that's fine. The investment was still worth it if you went through, gave this a real chance, and gave yourself the opportunity to find some ways that you may improve your show. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to. But it's a good thing to be open to those opportunities. So, Johnny, let's get in with these three questions. And today's topic is why you want to run a show at all. And this, when you talk about reassessment, this is probably the most fundamental question of all, because we're 400 episodes in now on the Assembly Call. You're 400 and some episodes in on Hack the Entrepreneur. This is our 113th episode of The Showrunner. You listening to this episode right now, you may be 5 episodes in, 25 episodes in, or 200 episodes in of your show, but you shouldn't take it for granted, and we shouldn't take it for granted that that next episode has to happen. It doesn't have to happen. And if the proper motivation isn't there and the proper reason to get behind the mic isn't there, then maybe it shouldn't happen, because there's an opportunity cost for everything. And, Johnny, what you and I are doing right now for the showrunner, what we do for our other shows, there is an opportunity cost to that. And so if we don't definitively know why we want to run this show in the first place, then it's valid to ask ourselves whether we should even be running it at all. And that is not, I don't believe, a question to be afraid of, because if you sit down and ask yourself these questions and you realize, you know what, I don't really have a good answer for why I'm running the show at all. Maybe I should be doing something else. We're not here to tell every single person you need to be running a podcast and you never should quit and all of that stuff. Sometimes that's the best decision that you can make. And I think these three questions, Johnny, that we're going to talk about here are going to help people come to that decision on their own, which is the only way that you can really come to a decision like this.
All right, let's get into the first question.
Let's do it. So the first question, Johnny, is why is serving this particular audience important to you? Because if serving the audience isn't important to you, then you really shouldn't be creating a podcast for them. And not just a podcast, but you shouldn't be creating content for an audience if the audience isn't important to you. Now, I think it's important to state that your own interest in a topic, just your general enthusiasm to talk about this topic, is a great reason for starting a podcast, and it can get you going and it can get you some momentum out of the gates, and that's fine. But I really think that at some point you have to transition to at least 50-50 being motivated by serving your audience. Because if you're not motivated by serving your audience, then decisions that you make about the experience that you're delivering to your audience are going to be very self-serving rather than audience serving. And when it comes to delivering the value to an audience that will eventually deliver value back to you so that you continue to do the show in the long term, if you're not really focused on serving the audience, you're thinking about it more from serving yourself, then that kind of virtuous circle there of value may not happen. So I think it's really important to be audience focused. And if you didn't start that way, to be transitioning that way. So that's the question. Why is serving this particular audience important to you? Can you articulate that to yourself? Because I think it's such a fundamental element of building a connection and building a show that can succeed over the long term.
Does the... So serving the audience, but here's what I'm trying to get at. We did an episode right near the beginning of our resurgence, or our reunion tour, which is kind of like the idea of aligning content to your audience, right? So it's serving them, but not necessarily. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can, or can you? I'm asking you, can you create a podcast? Can you create a show that is bringing people in because you know it either educates, entertains, or inspires them, but it's not necessarily what they need to be served with and how they need to be helped, but you're drawing them in with that so that you can then help them and serve them with possibly your service or your product or something else that you offer. And this is sort of just the top of the funnel or whatever. Not, I hate the term funnel, but the top of the place to kind of get them in.
It seems like even with what you're describing, your ultimate goal is still to serve an audience. So, right. I mean, your podcast, and we're going to talk about this, how we'll talk about this next week, how we've even changed the positioning of our show a little bit, to not just be about creating a podcast, but to succeed with a podcast-centered, content strategy. So, your podcast can serve different functions depending on where it is in your overall content strategy. But I think your overall aim has to be a genuine desire to serve this audience if you want to create that long-term connection. And so I think that can take on some different, some different ways. And again, your podcast can maybe fit different roles there. But ultimately, you've got to have that genuine desire to serve the audience. I don't see a way that you're going to succeed doing it long-term if everything is self-serving and not audience-serving.
Right. Okay. Right. So I guess I was just sort of seeing that sort of where it doesn't have to necessarily be a how-to podcast about this is going to help them. Particularly, that's the avenue to bring them in so you can serve them.
Yeah, I mean, like when I think about the assembly call, the whole reason that show started, we had this vague notion that maybe, some people would like, post-game talk about an IU basketball game. But, for the most part, it was the three of us, my co-hosts and I, that's kind of what we wanted. And so we got on there, to talk about the games. And it was, for the most part in the beginning, very self-serving. And, I've talked about this a lot on the show, how almost every offseason I wonder if I want to keep doing the show because I have this crisis of confidence in its actual meaning. And what always brings me back is I really love serving that audience. And I've opened myself up to getting emails and talking with people and finding out why it really matters, because I think it's pretty easy to understand why the showrunner would matter to somebody, because we're helping people go from point A to point B with their show and get better and build a podcast that they can monetize or, build a business around, all of that stuff. Why is it meaningful for people to spend an hour after a basketball game listening to people talk about it? And it was very hard to articulate for me until I started hearing about it from the audience. And once I realized, what, I really like serving this audience. Like, I grew up here. These are my people. This is the role that I play with this team and with this community of people to bring people together. And I really love serving the audience. And I would regret if I didn't have this role serving the audience anymore. That's what keeps me coming back to it. And I reassess that all the time. And so that's, I think it can take on different forms. But that's why I think it's so important that you really sit back and understand what it is about serving that audience that really gets you and that moves you and that gets you behind the mic and gets you wanting to keep creating a great experience for them.
Well said. Well said.
All right. So question number two. Question number one, why is serving this particular audience important to you? Question number two, and Johnny, maybe this gets at a little bit, what you were hinting at. Why is a podcast the best way to serve this audience? So, because again, with this episode, it is reassessing why you want to run this show at all, this podcast. So maybe you have a blog and an email newsletter and a lot of different things that you are doing, but talking specifically about the podcast, why is a podcast, given what you have to invest in it in terms of time and resources to do it well, why is this the best way to serve this audience? And I think if you're going to answer this question, it needs to be things like because you really want to create a deep connection with them, because you want the ability to provide on-demand content for an audience that they have some versatility in fitting into their day, because that's what makes a podcast great. People can listen to it while they're doing other things, fit it into the nooks and crannies of their day. You want to be able to provide that. If your topic lends itself well to conversation, that's a good reason to choose a podcast and why that might be a great way to serve the audience. Or, specifically that a segment of your audience consumes audio content. They've asked for it. The demand is there. There are others, but Johnny, I think you would agree, but you can confirm this. We know how much it takes to do a podcast well. So I think you do want to reassess whether a podcast is the right way to do it, or if you should be investing that time in more blog posts, or maybe doing, a video blog, or, creating something else. You want to make sure that a podcast is really the best way or one of the optimal ways to serve this audience.
You just gave 4 reasons why it obviously is.
Right. But that may not be the case for every audience is what I'm saying. Like if you can't.
Yeah. And so just in the few years that we've been doing this, I used to be very adamant about that. Like it was like lots of markets are not for podcasts. I'm getting way more lenient on that. As podcasting evolves, it seems like more and more markets, I'm not going to say all of them, and audiences are becoming aware and starting to consume podcasts because it's just becoming more prevalent, right? It's just everywhere. And it's not such a niche. It's not like a tech thing. It's not a marketing thing. It's really like, my mom listens to podcasts, like those kinds of things that are really cool. So that really, you got to make sure to verify that your audience is there. But if they're not yet, they probably will be, I would think, in the near future if things continue to evolve in that way.
Yeah. I think it just comes back to, if you have limited resources that you can invest, in this content strategy, make sure that if you're trying to choose between one or another, that if you choose podcasting, it's the right one. Like if this was a how-to podcast about how to set up your podcasting website, we would probably be better off doing video tutorials than doing a podcast. And it doesn't mean that we couldn't do both, but it just may mean that the podcast may not be the best way for this particular audience. So I just think reassessing that, I agree with you. I think more and more, it's almost like with every passing month, podcasting becomes a better, more accessible way to serve an audience. So I think in a lot of times this answer is going to be yes, and we gave you a lot of reasons why. But don't be afraid to reassess that, because let's say that you're 50 episodes in and you're like, well, shoot, I don't want to switch now. I've already started. It would be better to come to that realization now than doing 100 more episodes and then realize it's not the best way, and you could have been investing your time more wisely later on. That's all I'm saying.
So interestingly, that I haven't thought of before until now that you bring this up, is the reason why you and I and everyone listening could potentially really fall into this category of maybe creating one when it's not the best way to serve our audience is because we're all here, right? We're either listening to podcasts or we're making a podcast about podcasting because we're really into podcasting. But then that ties back to the first question, which just because you're really into podcasting, which you are because you're listening to podcasts and you're really into podcasts, doesn't necessarily mean that your audience is.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, right? And so it's kind of like, I guess you have to make sure that you are sort of the same or part of your audience if you're going to do that, or not just doing it to fulfill some sort of artistic endeavor that you want to do, but really you're trying to do it for like an actual business metric or something, because the two might not cross paths. So yeah.
And it can be one of those things, you host one podcast, you get comfortable with it. And what's the old saying? Like, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, So you may think, oh, well, now let me just do a podcast here and there and here and there. And again, all we're saying is just reassess it. Just reassess it. Reaffirm to yourself that a podcast is, the best way or an optimal way to serve this audience. And as long as, 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to be, as long as you did some proper planning and thinking about it ahead of time, then you can just move on with confidence. But if it's not, that's going to be a valuable decision, albeit maybe a painful one, but a valuable one for you to come to. Okay, so we were talking about 3 questions that are going to help you assess why you even want to run a show at all, or if you should be running a podcast. Question number 1 was, why is serving this particular audience important to you? Question number 2 was, why is a podcast the best way to serve this audience? And Johnny, here's question number 3. And this gets back to the episode that you referenced earlier that we did a few episodes back. But what results are you looking to generate? And are you generating, or are you on track to generating those results? So this is kind of a reassessment of, looking at your podcast, not just in terms of the audience and how you're serving the audience, and if it's, generally a good way to serve this audience, but is it a good way to serve yourself and your own goals too? What are the results that you want, and are you actually getting those results? And look, this can go beyond money. It's obviously totally fine if you want to generate money from your podcast, and that's an important metric, but it can also go beyond that, and it can go beyond business goals. It doesn't have to be that, but there have to be some kind of, quantifiable or even qualifiable results that you can clearly articulate so that you have some way of knowing if you're succeeding. And if you can't articulate this, then, number 1, you might be wasting your time that could be invested in a more valuable way for yourself or your business or your family, doing something else. And also, there's a good chance that your motivation probably isn't going to last long. And so if you're at episode 50 and you're not generating results and you don't even know what the results are, what are the chances that you're going to get to episode 100 with the same motivation if you don't even know how to assess whether what you're doing or not, whether what you're doing is succeeding or not? So that's why it's important to reassess this and constantly be looking at it to make sure that you're moving in a direction that you actually want to be moving in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the idea of it being going beyond money, it probably needs to be. It's hard to make sort of from the audio experience straight to a transactional thing for money is really hard. So you got to, like, if you're trying to sell something and if you're trying to monetize, which obviously I fully endorse, it's like, except for obviously having sponsors right on your show, but typically there'd be a step or 2 in front of money in that sense. And so to just have money as your metric when really actually you're just not getting your call to action right to get people onto your email list, to get them to go through the email sequence you've set up to then make money, isn't the podcast's fault. Or it could be at that point, but it's not necessarily the product's fault. Or you're getting a whole bunch of people onto the email list, but then you're losing them during the email sequence. Therefore, your podcast is working really well with what it's supposed to do, but you're still not making money. And so you could assess that as, well, the podcast isn't working, when really it's a different part of the chain. So it should be something really direct, like either visitors to your website. It could be email signups. It could be downloads. Like, and that's completely 100% subjective, obviously. Like, is 50 downloads per episode successful? Is 50 downloads a day successful? Is 50 a week? Is 50 a month? Is 50 a year? I can't decide that for you. Jared can't decide that for you. But you should sort of know that going into it. What will you consider successful? And then once you think you have that, push it by 10%. It's always good to kind of have a strive goal to go for. But I do see too many people out there talking. They might even be 6 months into it. They have what their download metrics are, but they were never aiming for anything. And they're just trying to ask people if those numbers are good. And it's like, well, I can't tell you that. I mean, you might have tripled what you wanted to do. So, man, it's amazing. You did 300% your goal. Or you might be completely off. And then you know that you have to reassess and really go over why you didn't hit those metrics. So just to kind of clearly state it, it's make sure your metrics are super narrowly and really closely aligned with your podcast. They're not further down the trail where other things could have gone wrong and now you're blaming the podcast for it. And so those off the top of my head are the few that I could think of, which is like listeners, downloads, email subscribers, or maybe visitors to your website, whatever your call to action happens to be, but make it really close.
Yeah. And what you just laid out, Johnny, is why the sequence of these questions is really important. Because, if you're looking at this and you're looking at your results and they're not there, and you haven't even really questioned yet whether a podcast is the right thing, you may start questioning everything. But if you've already gone through and you're like, okay, look, I know that I want to serve this audience. I know this audience is there. I really want to serve them. So I know that if you've answered number one in the affirmative, then you know that the reason that you're not getting results isn't because, your motivation isn't there or your willingness to serve the audience isn't there. It's like, I got that checked off. And if you went through number two and you affirmed for yourself that a podcast is a good way to serve this audience because, they listen to it and there's a demand and, you want to take advantage of all the benefits that podcasting has to offer. Well, now you can get to number three about results and say, okay, look, I'm bringing what I need to bring to the table. Podcasting is the right way to reach this audience, but the results aren't here. What is wrong in my process? Like you said, what's wrong with my call to action? Something else is wrong, but you don't have to look at the results and now question the entire foundation upon which your podcast is built. So you want to ask yourself these questions in the sequence that they're in, because if you can't answer number one, well, then it really doesn't matter if a podcast is a good way to serve this audience because you don't really give a damn about the audience anyway, and so it's not going to matter. And you're never going to build a deep connection with an audience if you don't care about them, because there's no way to hide that in your voice when you're behind the microphone in the first place. And, and if you can't build a connection with an audience via a podcast, then you're never really going to generate the results because it's just not going to happen. So the sequence, the order is important. And again, the questions: why is serving this particular audience important to you? Why is a podcast the best way to serve this audience? And what results are you looking to generate? And are you generating or on track to generating those results? If you ask yourself those three questions and are candid with yourself, honest with yourself, then you will know why you want to run a show at all. You have reassessed that. Hopefully it has, reaffirmed what you thought all along, and you're ready to move forward with vigor and enthusiasm, in the direction that you were going in. And it's not even really a worst case scenario. If you realize it's not, well, now you're able to cut bait sooner and move on to something that is a more worthwhile investment of your time. Either way, it's a success.
I take it. This feels good.
This does feel good.
I'm really looking forward to the rest of this series, especially the next episode.
Yeah, the next one's going to be fun. It's I'm actually working on both a course and a presentation on this topic. So I'm looking forward to next week's episode because it's going to give me a chance to kind of tease out some of the ideas, get some feedback from you, and help finalize the course and the presentation. So I'm excited about it. Also, we're about to get out of here in under 30 minutes, and that's been our goal, is to do these episodes in under 30 minutes.
So the site, it's up, it's running, it's brand new. It looks pretty darn snazzy, I would say. Showrunner.fm. If you haven't checked it out, we've moved houses. We're in a new location, but you can find us at the same address.
Showrunner.fm.
Interesting how the internet works.
It is.
Showrunner.fm. I don't know. We'd love some feedback on it, and you can get on that email list. You can hit reply. Let us know what you think. Tell if it's as snazzy as we think it is. Because I think it's pretty snazzy.
And we're making little improvements week by week and adding stuff to it. And we're going to have some blog post series coming. Obviously, the weekly episodes. We're going to do some live Q&As coming up. There's a lot that we have planned. We're excited that you're with us. We have reassessed why we want to be running a show, and we are 100% certain that we want to serve this audience, that a podcast is the right way to do it, and we're already seeing the results that we want to see. So check, and come back next week because we're going to talk about something that's really important. Positioning your podcast. Something else that's important to reassess. Johnny, you and I have spent a lot of time over the last 3-4 weeks talking about this. People can go to our website right now, and just from our headline in the description, you can kind of see the positioning that we have chosen. I alluded to it earlier, but we're going to walk through that in more depth next week on episode 114, and we look forward to talking with you then.
It's been fun. Take care.